Today, we're going to take a quick look at the investment presentation for a video game publisher. Thrilling stuff, I know, but this could end up being relevant to you because what's in this report says a lot about what kind of games these publishers are looking for, what they want to publish, what developers they want to work with, which of course in turn is going to determine what games get released and ultimately what games get made in the first place. Specifically, we're looking at some of the financial information for Devolver. Now, on the off chance you're not familiar with Devolver, they are one of the oldest and largest of the so-called indie publishers. They have, as of this recording, about 130 games. Their IPs include Enter the Gungeon, Hotline Miami, Cult of the Lamb, The Talos Principle, and Serious Sam. So they're pretty heavy hitters. They have a really good reputation in this space. Very hard to work with, I can tell you, because you may be wondering, well, have you ever worked with Devolver? No. They angle for fish way, way, way bigger than me. We're not going to go over this whole report because most of it is not going to be relevant. It's not going to be interesting. I want to look specifically at the parts relating to the games they're looking to acquire, invest in, and release. So we're not going to talk about their EBITDA. If you are actually curious about that, I will have links to the slideshow, to the full investor presentation if you're really interested, and I'll also throw in a link to the Game Discover Co-post where I first found out about this. I usually disagree with Simon Carlos's analysis, but in this case, we're pretty much of one mind, I think. So a reasonable place to start is with their sales mix, how much money they have made from their front catalog versus their back catalog, which is to say how much money they made from new games versus games released prior to 2024. And if you are seeing this, it's for 2024, it was overwhelmingly their older games. 7/8 of their money came from the older games. Now, granted, they usually, because they have a pretty big back catalog, they are usually making most of their money from their older titles. The exception from, we've got 5 years seen here, and the exception was 2022, which is not coincidentally the year Cult of the Lamb came out. We will absolutely be doubling back and talking about that more since it is far and away Devolver's biggest hit, far, far away their biggest hit as of late. But either way, you can see that just vast majority of their money came from older games because they really did not have a breakout hit last year in the same sense as something like Cult of the Lamb or some of their older games, some of the ones I mentioned earlier. What you had is a lot of games that still did quite well. Games they did release last year were very well received. They actually had one of their better years on Metacritic ever, up several points from the year before that. And in particular, Neva, which was one of the last games they released in 2024, had a Metacritic score of 87, which is very, very high for an indie, and also ended up winning a bunch of awards. So clearly they got a lot of notice for their games last year, but those games were not what were making money for them. It was the older titles. So what led Devolver to make so much money off of their older games? Well, it's a couple different things. There's a couple factors here. One of them is ports. There were a lot of significant ports last year. Devolver actually makes a pretty large portion of their money off of consoles, particularly off Nintendo's consoles. They've also started porting more of their games to mobile, so that was a big money maker. They have been leaning into doing more localization. Their games are available in more languages. In particular, they have been getting more of their games into the Chinese market, which is obviously a really big deal. But the most significant factor, I think, which is in their presentation, is quite prominent in their presentation, is paid DLC. So there was quite a bit of DLC released for their back catalog in 2024, along with major free updates. They had new content for, among other things, Cult of the Lamb, Astroneer, Wizard with a Gun, Talos Principle 2, as well as some newer games. But this is pretty significant. This is what we're looking at here, is something that I have previously referred to as the live service light model. Now, what you're doing here is not a constant regular release schedule of new games with seasons and battle passes and such like you'd see in a true live service game, But what you're seeing is a game that starts off kind of looking like a premium box release, but then gets a semi-regular drip feed of new content through premium DLC and free updates over potentially years and years on end. It's already a popular way to approach strategy games. I've mentioned before, Paradox is really leaning into this, one of my favorites. RPGs are starting to go in this direction. Like coming up later this month, Sea of Stars is getting its first major content release. A couple other RPGs I've looked at, 8-Bit Adventures 2, which is a game I looked at a few years ago. They've been doing regular major releases. So this is something that even just smaller, fully independent developers are doing, but it's become much more systemic with larger developers and publishers. Now, the way that you make money off of DLC is threefold. First, and most obviously, if it's premium DLC, people are paying you for more content, straight up. But there are other ways as well. Second, you get more attention when you release DLC or even a major free content update. This can work with free releases too, and that drives more people to notice the game in the first place. This is something Carlos suggested. It's almost like what they call a line extension in retail sales, where you see companies, soda companies, for example, release tons of these sort of limited edition specialty sodas, not really to sell that many of those, but just to draw your attention, to take up more shelf space. And that's kind of what they're doing here. Every time you get a new content release, whether it's premium or free, more people notice it that didn't see it in the first place, or it maybe pushes fence sitters off of the fence. Third is later on down the line, it helps with things like bundles. The more DLC you have, the more things you can put together. It makes for a better value proposition, and it also makes the inevitable definitive edition look much better when you have a lot of content and it seems like you're getting a better deal. People will buy things if it feels like they're getting more from the bargain. Which then leads us into the next part, because what we learn from this is that relying on a strategy of using your back catalog, using older games with DLC and free releases is a safe strategy. It's one that's been working out very, very well for developers and publishers over the last few years. But for publishers in particular who are also acquiring new games all the time, this means you have to kind of reassess what you're doing in terms of those new games, because all of these companies have become very risk averse. Video games have become a much riskier proposition from just a dollars and cents perspective in recent years. They're getting more expensive and they're returning less money. So what these companies have to do is reassess the new games they're bringing in. And for Devolver, that means new games in the future are going to be getting less money. Now, according to Devolver, in 2022, the average cost of one of their third-party titles, so something that they acquired, the money they put into it, the money they invested in terms of development and marketing, was just under $3 million. Now, I should mention that does appear to be mean average, so it's no doubt skewed. Probably a few of their games got much larger proportion of that money, and some of them got less. Nevertheless, $3 million is, put bluntly, a shitload of money. A shitload of money for an indie. The people I talk to, if they're getting $100,000, they're ecstatic. Now, the typical developer, I'm sure, did not get anywhere close to $3 million, but even if the typical dev was getting a tenth of that, $300,000, that's still a lot for a lot of these small games. And it's one of the reasons why Devolver games tend to look so good. They're investing very heavily. But the problem is, as these games are becoming riskier, as they're returning less money, you have to also reduce the amount of money you're putting into them. So for last year, that amount had dropped to an average of a little over $2 million. And their plan is to keep drawing that down so that by next year, their average investment will be only $1 million. That's a steep drop. And it means that in the future, kind of upstart developers who work with Devolver are going to get less money. They will still be putting out new games. And I'm sure they will be putting out new games at the same rate. I'm sure 2 years from now, when the money in this pool has dropped off so much, they'll probably still be putting out about 10 games a year. But the developers of those games, if they're unproven, are going to be getting a lot less money. Because from Devolver's perspective, it makes a lot more sense to do Gungeon 2 than to take a flyer on a brand new developer who has an interesting idea that might work out. Now, there is a word I have been sort of skipping around throughout this, and that's franchises. What we're talking about is Devolver aiming more to develop franchises that they can build and profit from over a long period of time, as opposed to individual one-off games that make money once and then the developer does something else. So 20 words or less, if you are sick of franchises, then buckle in because we're stuck with them for a while. I think that this also feeds into the hollowing of the industry that I've talked about in a couple different videos here, which is that these sort of mid-range, mid-card games with medium-sized budgets just are not working like they used to. At this point, for these larger publishers, and I guarantee you Devolver is not alone here, it makes more sense to put most of your money behind your big tentpole games that you know are going to return a profit, and then to experiment with much smaller sums of money with much humbler games, which I think is what we're going to see more of in the future from a lot of these sort of mid-sized publishers. Is you're going to see 1 or 2 really big releases a year that get all of the attention, that get all of the money, and then you're going to see, 6, 8, 10, 12, whatever releases that are much, much smaller games made on much, much smaller budgets that are easier to recoup that money. And honestly, it's a matter of perspective whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. You may think this is good. And honestly, as somebody who, to be frank, if I wasn't doing reviews, I would not be playing this huge variety of video games. I am kind of one of these. I pick 1 or 2 or 3 and stick with them for a long period of time. So this kind of works out for me too. But it does sort of say something about the range of games we're going to see. We're probably not going to see as many really more experimental or like riskier, bolder games going forward. We're not going to see as many high production value games going forward. Those are going to be concentrated more around IPs, franchises that have already proven themselves. And I do think that whether or not this produces better games, it does have something of a negative effect on the overall market, on the creative space that surrounds them. But that's my take. What do you think? Sound off in the comments.